Hello and welcome to the Gaggle, where we challenge and, if necessary, destroy media narratives. I'm George Szamuely. With me today, of course, is co-founder of the Gaggle, Peter Lavelle. And today we're very fortunate to have as a special guest, Larry Johnson. He's, of course, well known to gagglers. He's a former CIA analyst. He's a former State Department analyst. He's also trained personnel for special operations for many years. And of course, more recently, he's been very actively involved in analyzing the military situation and political situation around Ukraine. So obviously, there's much to discuss. And I'll just start off with, obviously, there's three big events. I mean, we have last week the announcement by President Putin of the partial mobilization. Then, of course, we have the ongoing referendums in Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics, and then in the two oblasts of Zaporozhye and Kherson. And then we have the political earthquake, could be, in Italy, where a kind of a right-wing populist government is about to take power and could, we don't know, affect the entire Europe's attitude towards Russia, and particularly towards sanctions and towards really escalating the war. So, let's just throw it out there. What's your take on all this, Larry?
Just another quiet day in the universe, right? Let's start with Italy. I think there may be some misplaced hope that Georgina, I guess is how they pronounce her name, is going to come in and separate from the current EU policy towards Russia. I think, some of the things that she said may indicate that she's going to, double down or stay in there. And this is what I don't understand: the complete disconnect between the politicians, the people, and the reality of what they're facing with the war, the special military operation in Ukraine, because the economic situation is so dire, and it's not getting better. I know that I always turn on Sky News for entertainment here in the United States just to see, what sort of madness they're up to, and the pound has fallen to the lowest level in 50 years. And so the internal turmoil, that political turmoil in the UK, it's only going to escalate. I don't see any way to come out and sort of pour oil on troubled waters here, and that they'll be able to unite and say, yes, Ukraine is the #1 priority for us in the world. The other aspect is that with Russia's and I think the move to hold the referenda in these four oblasts, soon to be new republics in Russia, it has been the ultimate game changer. Yep. And people have not thought that through and realized the implications of it. Mm-hmm. Because once that is Russian territory, then Russia can take the gloves off. I know for a fact, I've got friends that are still active duty in the military and the intelligence community. And very early on in this entire, even as the build up to the 24th of February and the subsequent activities, I know that the intelligence community was scratching its head. They couldn't figure out why Russia was holding back. It was holding back in terms of military personnel deployed. It was holding back in terms of the technology, the weapons technology deployed on the battlefield. They never quite could wrap their minds around it, and still 6 months in, haven't figured it out. Well, Russia hasn't figured out, I think. They were deliberately holding back because I think on the one hand, they hoped that with this initial, let's call it minimal military effort, that the Ukrainians could be persuaded to come to their senses. And that turned out not to be the case. So now Russia, who has faced, and I think correctly so, senses that they face an existential threat. is going to act accordingly and fight back. And the West, particularly in Washington, the Biden clown show, as I call it, accompanied by all the various little lapdogs of Europe that run around attached to Uncle Sam's leash, they completely misunderstand the Russia's reaction. They really think that they can bully and threaten, and ultimately Russia is going to fold. And the propaganda effort that's underway in the West, not to defeat the Russians, but to actually mislead the American public, the European public, I've never seen anything like it. I mean, and I had firsthand involvement in the CIA covert action propaganda campaign against the Soviets in Afghanistan. So I know a little bit how this game is played. Of course, that was in the days pre-social media, but still, even with that as a benchmark, I've never seen anything like it.
You know, we could just speak really quickly about Italy. I tend to agree with you. George and I talked about this yesterday. I think I think that there's this misguided belief that if a new government comes in, a right-wing government, conservative government, populist government, if you keep your poker in with the anti-Russia crusade, they'll cut you some slack at home. Well, that's not going to happen. I mean, Poland is the most fanatical of them all, and Brussels still wags its finger. Hungary, which I think is in kind of the middle, they've paid lip service to it, but they're not actively involved in this. Orbán says this is not our conflict. It shouldn't be Europe's conflict. He doesn't earn any brownie points. And so I think this new government in Italy, if they're naive in thinking that, I think we'll see how it plays out. But nonetheless, it's a slap in the face to the neoliberal order of Europe and of the West in general. And I just hope it will serve as some kind of demonstration effect, but it will only serve as a demonstration effect if they actually do something, which remains. Right. It's like Republicans coming to power. Yeah, whippy, open the champagne bottle, and then the Democrats run the agenda. That's always how it works. Okay. Going to Ukraine right now, I think you're absolutely spot on. What I think is really this propaganda effort directed against Russia. There's this propaganda the consumer of this propaganda are the people that generate it. They believe in their own propaganda. Because George and I over the last few weeks, particularly, just discussing the perceptions of time. And I asked you that question in my program last time you were on. I said, who's got the clocks, who's got the time? Yeah. And you said both. Yeah. Explain to me why you said that to our audience. Go ahead.
The United States and Europe are in the process of, let's call it, demilitarizing themselves. They are supplying weapons to Ukraine that the Russians are destroying on a daily basis. And with the combination of the destruction of these weapons, the United States does not have the industrial base to build it up, to replace it quickly. I think right now they've used in 6 months the number of javelins that have been. Can you hear my dogs howling?
A little bit.
Let me quiet them for a second. I don't know what they're seeing. Stand by.
Okay. I just want to tell Gaggle it's not my dog, because my dog is not that big.
They sound exactly. They sound a lot bigger than your dogs. So those are loud barks. Yeah.
Sorry about that. I have 2 Rottweilers, and
it sounds like
somehow they saw something outside, and decided that they had to protect the house. Oh yes. Mine look just like that.
Not my dog.
Anyway, you first get into the military aspect of this, that the West continues to supply these weapons, and up to this point, I've called it's been spring cleaning, where they've taken all the junk that was stored in their closet that they hadn't used for a while, and were sending it to Ukraine, and kept kidding themselves it was going to be decisive, and Russia was defeating that. then it has, in tandem with the military side, you've got the economic side that, boy, we're going to punish Russia with these sanctions. And I to this day, I do not understand the West's obsession with sanctions, because we do not have a single historical example where the sanctions have worked. I mean, Cuba is, we got 60 plus years there. That's, it just hasn't worked. It does not force regime change. It does not force the policy change. And yet in this case, they chose for some reason to impose sanctions on Russia that are literally destroying the economies in Europe and in the United States. So from that standpoint, I think of it like a poker game, with who's holding the chips, who's holding the best cards. Russia holds the chips and the cards. They have the military advantage because Russia, despite the Western delusion that Russia is this imperial power keen on conquering the world, all that is a psychological projection by the United States, because Russia has not been out sending its military forces, its carrier task force to different countries around the world, launching marine amphibious invasions. That's been the United States. That's not Russia. Russia is contained, and Russia uses its military force for national defense. And from that standpoint, there's nothing that NATO and the United States could do short of declaring a complete mobilization, shutting down the economies, saying we're going to go on a war footing, we're going to invade Russia.
Sorry, Larry. I mean,
impossible.
do you actually, do you rule out the United States actually, in effect, declaring a war economy? Just as you say, they've destroyed all this equipment that's been sent to Ukraine. So they say, okay, let's increase our production tenfold.
No, they can't.
You say it can't be done? It can't be done?
No. We don't have the industrial base anymore. This is not, the United States is not like it was in 1940, 1941, where you had a lot of idled workers. You had a bunch of factories that were around that were not functioning at any level because of the effects of the Great Depression. The United States has effectively deindustrialized. There are disincentives for the production of coal, production of oil, production of steel, production of aluminum, and increasingly the United States, the key metals, rare earth minerals that are required for producing more technological systems like computers and such, that's been exported overseas as well. So it's not like there's this flip that can be switched. In fact, I think if I read one study, I think it was by Russi in the UK, that there used to be, let's say, 5 factories to generate, just to produce ammunition in the United States alone for the US military. That's down to 1 now. So there is no they just can't magically turn it on. Whereas Russia's, and again, this is one of those things that's just bizarre, that the West has always presented Russia as this backwater, third world, hellhole that could barely rub 2 sticks together. And yet Russia's industrial capability exceeds that of the United States. And it's able to produce rocket engines. It's able to continue to produce caliber missiles, cruise missiles of a great variety. And again, another thing I know for a fact is US generals, based upon the intelligence back in April and May, were saying Russia's going to run out soon. They can't continue at this pace. No country has that much.
But Russia, their factories are working 3 shifts a day, 3 shifts a day. So what I find very, very strange, we had Scott Ritter on not too long ago. And if you know anything about Russian military history, I'm not an expert, I'm a novice, I like to read it. What they're best at is logistics. That's what they do. They do logistics. That's how they won the Napoleonic Wars. It was logistics, not just sheer mass of men. No, logistics. And it's being played out now. And that goes to this mobilization here, is that they calibrate and they calibrate. It's very interesting watching their decision-making process, because I think a lot of us, there's a bit of an impatience for an outcome. But again, they have the time, they have the clocks, they have the chips, they have the cards, okay? And it seems to me, I have come to the conclusion, maybe wrong, but I think there's the perception on the Russian side is that in a way, the longer the better, because we're seeing Europe fray in every single possible way. And it's only the end of September.
Well, right. Why should Russia look to get into let's put it in terms of two men who are opposing each other. Your option is to walk into the room and start punching each other, get into physical confrontation face to face. Or if you can basically stand outside the building where your potential opponent is and set it on fire, then let them worry about how to get out of the building on fire, which is the better option? I'd choose the fire, because then you're more in control of what's taking place. And that is, that's where I think Russia is right now, that they recognize. I think there's been an awakening process for them too during this process, because I think initially they may have been inclined to believe that the West actually had a plan, and that they had some secret cards that they were holding and that they would play against Russia. And candidly, I think I could see Putin and the generals sitting around going, surely they can't be this stupid. And my response would be, oh yeah, no, they absolutely can. You've underestimated their stupidity. And that's where people they can't believe that. There's always the belief that there's some sort of secret plan behind the scenes, like the Wizard of Oz, the man behind the curtain pulling all the levers and turning on all the lights, and that in this process that there's really some rabbit the West is going to pull out of the hat that will trap Russia, who is the equivalent of the Roadrunner now, and that the Wile E. Coyote will finally get the Russian Roadrunner, and it just ain't going to happen because
there is a lot. Go ahead.
Go ahead. No, go ahead.
Yeah, no, there's still an aspect to it like this, that the United States has been gradually more and more involved in Ukraine. They've crossed one red line, they've crossed another red line, keep sending more and more lethal weaponry. And there are two models that you can go back to, which is World War I and World War II. So you have Woodrow Wilson, he runs in 2016 promising no involvement in the war. No, absolutely not, we're not getting involved. FDR did the same thing. Now in both cases, they were lying to the public, just as the Biden administration, which rules out, no, we're not gonna get involved, absolutely not, no, we're staying out. Can one really be sure that they're not going to get involved, that they're not already somehow secretly making plans to get directly involved in Ukraine, just as FDR was making secret plans to get involved in World War II?
Well, come back then to ask the question: where are the resources? So, to get involved, they would need to do a variety of things. One, they would have to dramatically augment the number of personnel currently serving in the U.S. Army in particular. They don't have the ground forces. So to change that, there would have to be a draft or call up of some sort. And what we're seeing right now, in fact, is that the U.S. military in all branches, the Army, the Navy, the Air Force, the Marine Corps, they can't recruit. They're having trouble attracting recruits, in part because they've been following this incredibly stupid woke agenda where they're more concerned about diversity and wokeness than actual military preparedness.
And maybe keeping Trump supporters out of the military, which is stupid in itself.
Yeah. No, I mean, they have literally attacked the very base that has been the primary source of recruits for the military over the last 50 years. And I know a lot of these people that, they're telling their sons and grandsons, don't go, don't join, stay away. So you've got that. So, but I'm saying you would see the buildup. There would have to be a buildup. There would have to be the movement of troops in that direction. That doesn't happen overnight. There's this thing in the U.S. military. It's called JOPS, Joint Operations Planning Environment, and the whole JOPS process contains an element called the TIP-FID, the time phase forward troop deployment. So that you would start moving troops in a certain direction. That starts 8 months out at least, maybe 6 months. It doesn't happen in a week or two. So from the standpoint, we're not seeing the troop movement. So what else did they have? Well, how about aircraft carriers? Let's move aircraft carriers close to Russia. Good luck with that. Russia has hypersonic missiles, and the carriers have no defense to that. So it might as well just like taking a big fat turkey that is ready to be slaughtered and having to walk out on a gun range. You know, people will fire away. What about their air capabilities? Again, NATO's got limited ability with both cruise missiles and with fixed wing aircraft, because thanks to George W. Bush, 2001, the United States told Russia, oh, forget it, we're out of this anti-ballistic missile treaty. Forget it, we're going to show you. And what's happened? Russia has created the most robust air defense system of any country in the world, hands down. And best of all, it's been tested real world against real weapons and is performing very well. It's not perfect, but it sure beats the hell out of the other. And what does that mean? And I'm not advocating this, but it means Russia can fight and win a nuclear war. And why do I say that? Because Russia can launch its missiles and hit targets in the United States. The United States does not have any air defense system that can stop the Russian missiles, period. Russia, however, does have air defense systems that can shoot down ballistic missiles sent by the United States. And again, in raising that, I'm not advocating that. I'm just saying it's a reality. As a military planner, you've got to take that into account. If the U.S. military planners are ignoring that, they are fools. I don't think they're complete fools. I think there are at least one or two that recognize, we're playing a lopsided game here.
You serious?
We haven't even begun to.
Mutually assured destruction is not reality anymore. The Russians can really prevail in a nuclear war.
Yes, that's what I believe. I believe that's the case. Let's call it. It's now the myth of mutual assured destruction, and that began with the United States walking away from the ABM treaty, because up to that point, the ABM treaty did limit what each country could do in terms of developing missile defense systems. What happened is the United States was actually keen in 2001, prior to 9/11, the focus of the early Bush administration was on missile defense, which is one of the reasons that they withdrew from the ABM treaty. And then with 9/11, all of a sudden they turned to trying to fight Islamic insurgency and completely ignored the missile defense investment. Russia didn't. Russia, man, pressed the gas pedal down and took off, and has developed, you got from S-300, S-400, S-500, and it got also equipped itself now to fight a space war, take out satellites, because Russia is less dependent upon satellite technology for information control over the battlefield than the United States. And so, this can get, we can get into sort of three-dimensional chess here with the different iterations that could take place between ground combat, air combat, and space combat. But so with all of that off the board, I don't see where would the West, how would they do it? I don't see how they could do it, simply because they don't have the resources either in personnel or in equipment to carry out an effective attack. And then there's history. Every single country that's tried to invade Russia hasn't turned out so well.
Yeah, it's you get the impression they want to woke themselves to victory, woke themselves to, to will Russia's defeat. Political facts are being created on the ground in Ukraine. These referendums are very, very important. And
Right.
the rule of thumb here is on September 30th, they will be inducted into the Russian Federation. That's a serious political fact that's been created. And there's hoopla about Russia and using nukes and all that. Again, this is intentional disinformation. I mean, it's very obvious their nuclear doctrine, it has not changed whatsoever, even if when these republics are part of the Russian Federation. Do you think that's going to be tested here one way or another? Because that's what really bothers me, because the way George and I have looked at it is that this is a very important demonstration effect, because once they become part of Russia, they will be defended, and it sends a message to other oblasts or regions in Ukraine. It can be done.
Right. Well, it is the West's inability to come to grips with reality. They're still in denial about Crimea, but Crimea is, it's now under Russia's control. It's part of Russia, as it had been historically, but we're not going to that. So the West has not worked its way through this. They're going to sit there and insist, oh, we're not going to recognize you. You're not invited to our party. This is like the kind of crap that kids in high school, secondary education get into, where they form cliques and try to ostracize certain others, and then in the process hope to gain some leverage. Russia doesn't care. I think Russia's now come to the point where it doesn't care. It realizes everything we've tried to do to get along with these people, all the gestures we've made, the ways we've tried to cooperate, completely rejected. Or maybe it's more like someone who's been trying to woo a particular romantic partner, and finally recognize, no matter how many flowers I buy, how much candy I bring, or how much jewelry I buy, they have no interest in me. So I'll go and find something else. And that's why I think we've seen this emergence, the budding relationship with China. I mean, I would say Henry Kissinger is rolling over in his grave, except he's still above Earth, so he can roll over in bed with anxiety. But watching this is everything he tried to prevent in the 1970s with Nixon's opening to China, to try to drive a wedge between Russia, the then Soviet Union, and China. Well, that's now, let's say, blown up 50 years of U.S. foreign policy, and the Chinese and the Russians are both getting talked to by the United States and by the West in the most undiplomatic terms. It's remarkable.
Larry, one of the things I find very, very peculiar is that China, Russia, Iran, India, they think in geopolitical terms, like time immemorial. Okay, empires come and go, realign themselves, reinvent themselves. But these people in the West, they don't believe in geopolitics anymore. It's almost like they believe in unicorns, democracy versus autocracy. And most of the world is like, what is he talking about? What are they talking about?
Yeah, no, I spent, about 8 years teaching after I left government service. I was teaching in a seminar that the U.S. Anti-Terrorism Assistance Training Program put on for foreign governments. And so one government a month would come to the United States. We did the Senior Crisis Management Seminar, and it would involve police and civil members of the government, not military. And my job, I was to teach the terrorism threat lecture, and then the human rights lecture on how not to pull out fingernails and treat people right. So in the course of this, I dealt with people from over 65 countries, everyone from Syria to Saudi Arabia to Colombia to Cyprus to Japan, across the world, even Israel. And I found a common theme among all these different countries, different religions. They come from different ethnic backgrounds, religious backgrounds, language backgrounds, but they all had this belief that the United States had a secret policy, particularly this was around the time when we invaded Iraq in 2003. They literally believed that the United States had some some hidden program, some hidden information that they just weren't telling the rest of the world about. Because these guys knew that whenever they talked to the United States, they would lie about what they were actually up to, or they would try to hide what they were doing, and they would play it, as you noted, Peter, in a geopolitical. They were thinking the geopolitical implications of that. And I had to tell them, I said, guys, sorry to burst your bubble, but no. I mean, they literally are not, it's driven entirely by local politics. They're not thinking with a strategic vision of what does this mean for the United States in terms of its position in the world? What does this mean in terms of our relationships with these other people? It's very, very much a very short time horizon, and primarily talked about in terms of, is this going to win me domestic political support or not? And
don't you think
the answer to those yes, screw the rest of the world.
But don't you think that what they're doing toward Russia is part of a plan, which is essentially to destroy Russia, eliminate it once and for all as any kind of a geopolitical rival to the United States? In other words, the first phase was the NATO expansion, which was, they seized that opportunity. They moved so quickly. NATO expansion, that boxes Russia in. And now the second phase, which is just to simply to drain it, to bleed it dry, to destroy it as much as it can, leading to a collapse in Moscow. And then the country breaks up into mutually antagonized regions. Isn't that part of the plan that is in the minds of the policymakers?
I wouldn't say it's a plan, because a plan implies that you're going to put together the resources necessary and you have a series of actions you're going to take to ultimately accomplish that. I can't, what I hope that the folks watching us today in this chat, what they understand is that the level of ignorance in the United States with respect to Russia and history is profound. It is profound and widespread. I participate every week in an afternoon discussion group with I won't use the name that they go by, but it's a group of very accomplished men and women. I mean, people that have run investment firms, that have run large manufacturing interests. They're investors. These are some big dollar, well-experienced people. They're not ignorant. They're not unintelligent. Yet, the things they believe about Russia, like, oh yeah, Russia's got a second-rate military, and Russia they're having to go to the prisons to grab people because nobody will fight, and it's like, guys, have you seen pictures of like Russia's subways as just an example? And compare Russia's subways in Moscow with the subways in New York City. Where would you feel more comfortable getting on a train and riding? I mean, in New York City, you basically need to carry a firearm or some sort of weapon to fend off not just some of the other passengers, but the rats that infest the thing. And yet, the United States persists, and boy, we are the #1 country in the world. Do we have our act together?
Larry, I think that both you and George can be right at the same time, I think, because I think it's just because it's this messianic element of the neoliberal order, is that, well, number one, we won the Cold War, okay, which is a myth. We could talk about that later.
Right,
it's a myth,
right.
But it's a very important myth for these people. And ergo, we won because they are bad. So because their badness somehow continues, and it has to be destroyed, because it's so bizarre. These people are so secular and anti-faith, anti-religion, but they function in a worldview that is very, very cultish. And
Yeah.
again, this is just like this unicorn view. You know, they are bad people, so they can, by their very nature, they cannot continue to exist. I mean, it's infantile thinking, but I think I see it in the pages of the broadsheets every single day. It's either overt or covert, and then watching ridiculous people on cable TV that couldn't fight their way out of a paper bag.
Yeah. No, I mean, it is, there's such a disconnect. I haven't come up with a good explanation for it, but there is a disconnect between the feelings towards Putin in particular, Russia in general, and the reality. Because I ask people, I said, well, they'll go, well, Putin's a godless communist. I go, well, actually, he's an Orthodox Christian, number one. Number two, he's not a communist. He's a nationalist. What most people in my side of the ocean don't understand is the let's call it our elite class. They are pissed at Putin because he wouldn't be their prison bitch. When he refused to play the game with the oligarchs and actually started cutting the wings of the oligarchs. I got hired, was it back in 2002 by
that's about the time.
A lobbying firm, APCO in Washington, D.C., when Miguel Khodorkovsky was first arrested. And they were looking for information in Russia and such. So, I got hired to try to help them at that time. Well, that's a Washington lobbying firm. What the hell, it means all this money that was being paid by people connected to Khodorkovsky to Washington, D.C. lobbyists to try to help him out in Russia. Now, all of this, what this is speaking to is that the West plan, going back to George's question, their ultimate plan was to figure out how to get their hands on all the Russian loot, the raw materials, the gas, the oil, the uranium, the aluminum, the nickel, let's go down the list. And Putin thwarted that. And yet to portray Putin as the, worse than Hitler, worse than Stalin, I mean, it is so disconnected from reality. But I got to emphasize, people really believe this. And I've been pilloried as an agent of Putin. And I said, well, I must not be very good because I'm not getting paid. But when I just try to point out, look at the number. If a Martian arrived on planet Earth tomorrow and asked for the history of the last 30 years, so give me the list of the country that has invaded the most other countries with military forces. The one at the top of the list be the United States, not Russia. Russia would be at the bottom of the list. I mean, in the West, they conflate what happened in Crimea as quote a Russian invasion, what happened in Georgia as a Russian invasion. But that's really it. And then, Russia invaded the Donbass, except no, not really. They provided some military support, but they certainly didn't put in frontline troops. So those are but what about Russia and Syria? Yeah, that's actually a case where Russia is invited into Syria to help from the way you do it in international relations, whereas the United States, in complete violation of international law, is running around militarily in Syria and arming Islamic rebels and helping create the mayhem and confusion. So, but on my side of the Atlantic, people, they don't see that. All they see is,
one of the things,
Putin bad.
Some of the things that I've come across. I mean, looking at like responsible statecraft, that kind of stuff, which is a huge disappointment, I must say. But it's so tragic and very dangerous to personalize everything. I keep in contact with some of my graduate student friends, and that's many decades now. And these are smart people. These are accomplished people. And they always say, well, it's just because of Putin. And I just, they're my friends. I try to be polite and courteous. But they have a difficult time understanding national interests. So I say, well, if it's Putin now, but the next person is going to be more or less like him, maybe personality different, but he's going to be pursuing the same policies because he's pursuing the policies that enhance the national security and interests of the Russian Federation, which is one of the reasons why Putin's popularity has remained very buoyant the entire time he's been in high office. And that happens in the West because they don't, because there's no sense of international law. There's no sense that any other country has a national interest. Only the United States does.
And what they don't, I mean, just to follow up on that point, is what they don't really realize that if they want to make it all about Putin, and you say, okay, but let's look at Putin 20 years ago. Let's look at Putin 15 years ago. Let's look at Putin even 10 years ago. That Putin was very favorably inclined towards the West. So in other words, this was a person who, he came to the United States. He was meeting, Nancy Pelosi. He went to Crawford, Texas. He went to Kennebunkport. So if you've now say, Putin is so terrible, it's the same Putin. And so then you have to ask, well, how did it come about that this person who wanted to cooperate with the West has now really turned against the West and now talks about the West in the way that communists once used to talk about the West, that they just want to exploit the earth just for their own own ends, and we have to fight that.
Yeah, and to leave off on that, I mean, I think George and I were a bit surprised that the almost a tinge of this anti-colonialism is Western colonialism has seeped into the Russian discourse, which was not there even a year ago.
Yeah, well, I still do not understand why the West was so keen in 2014 to create the coup in Maidan. I think one element of it was involves the Clintons, because it is no coincidence that Ukraine was the #1 contributor to the Clinton Foundation of all countries in the world, and we're talking vast amounts of money. The economic resources that are in Ukraine, particularly in the eastern oblasts, there's absolutely no reason that Ukraine should be one of the poorest countries in the world, and particularly in Europe. Absolutely. It really should have been one of the wealthiest.
Absolutely.
So what happened in the Maidan, it just didn't sprout out of the ground. It was a deliberate plan. It was, this is a case where you can have intelligence officers they come up with an absolute plan of how are we going to destroy this society? How are we going to install someone that we're going to see as more malleable and usable by us? But why did they choose that particular moment in 2013, culminated in 2014?
A little bit of background here. This is something that is just so rarely talked about, but there were oligarchs in the East, in the Donbass, the Party of Regions, which has been banned, is that they were looking at the European Association Agreement. They were licking their chops, but because for them, they weren't thinking about Ukraine, and it's one of the most misgoverned countries in the world. They were thinking about how can they launder their money and become respectable. And going through the association agreement, they thought would be one way of doing it. Now, of course, the Victorian Newlands and Jeffrey Pia, they were thinking in terms of assaulting Russia. This is a backdoor to go after Russia. So there was this kind of colliding of interests that were not completely aligned, but both sides thought they would get something out of it. And then Yanukovych, George and I have joked about this many times, he gets the association agreement, I think it's like 1,800 pages long, and he's going page after page, like, where's the money? There's no money here. Okay, because the intention was that Ukraine would be more connected to European financial institutions, and the oligarchs were very much in favor of that. Then the Maidan happened, and then we saw what the real thing was. No, after the Maidan, the only thing Ukraine could export to Europe were eggs. That was the only one item that they passed muster on, eggs. And there was then there was this realization. Of course, they were hoodwinked. In the association agreement, there is a assistance regarding intelligence and defense. Of course, the NATO back door. Okay, and of course the coup government signed it lickety split.
Yeah, I mean, it is, you know, why they decided to make Ukraine really one of the top priorities from a foreign policy standpoint, and yet keep it on the back burner. I don't understand what was really, from the Western standpoint, driving that so much. But it happened, and yet throughout, from 2014 until February of this year, 98% of the people in America, they couldn't find Ukraine on a map. And that's if you either had a gun to their head or offered them $10 million if they could correctly identify it. But now all of a sudden, the United States, our foreign policy is much like the attention span of a 3-year-old child. So when I was at the CIA from 85 to 89, Central America, Afghanistan, and Angola, those were the top 3 priorities. I mean, anything that you would write about that, and President Reagan and then President Bush Sr., they were all over it. Those were the issues. Anything else about China, that was sort of backwater, or Russia, nobody was paying attention to the impending collapse of the Soviet Union. So, but then all of a sudden, the Soviet Union collapses, and everyone goes, "Oh my God!" And then people are scurrying about. So it's just, they go from crisis to crisis. They play with a toy, and then they see that toy that someone else has, and they run over and get it. It's very much like, it's very childish in that regard.
But the interesting thing, Larry, with what you're saying is that what you just listed, Central America, Angola, Afghanistan, and even before that, Vietnam, in a way, they're just colonial wars. I mean, the United States is going to win them. I mean, these are countries that cannot possibly pose any kind of a threat or challenge to the United States. Lebanon, you can throw in Lebanon and so on. Now they're in something wholly different, something that the American leadership had always avoided. The one thing you don't do is you don't get yourself in a confrontation with a nuclear superpower. That's the one thing you don't do. You can clobber Vietnam, Iraq, and everybody else. You don't do this. And that's what the United States has now got itself into. And that is really baffling, how they managed to get themselves into this confrontation.
Yeah, well, the military that has grown up in the last 20 years in the United States, and I worked on this firsthand in supporting an exercise program in the U.S. The military is always training, so that they're either training or they're supposed to be fighting, and so in peacetime it's mostly training. And the training area I was focused on was for U.S. Special Operations Forces responding to terrorist threats around the world, because that's where the military priority, planning, and resources shifted in the wake of 9/11, and then the United States' subsequent involvement in places like Iraq, the invasion 2003, and then the occupation, so-called, of Afghanistan, which turned out to be a complete bust. And with all of that, it literally transformed the U.S. military. They're in no condition to fight a peer-to-peer battle. In fact, the reality for the U.S. military is it has not fought a peer foe since the end of World War II. Some could argue it happened in Korea with the Chinese. Okay, we'll concede that. But it didn't happen in Vietnam. In Vietnam, yes, the North Vietnamese did have some aircraft, and there were some air-to-air combat missions. But in terms of what the United States has experienced, particularly over the last 30 years, where we send in our tanks, we send in our planes, we send in our troops, and they're not facing sustained artillery bombardment by the force they're attacking. They're not sustaining aerial attacks from bombs and or strafing runs by the fixed wing aircraft of the opposing force. They're not, so when you go down the list, but now that's exactly what the Ukrainians are facing with the Russians, and U.S. Mercenaries or U.S. soldiers that have left the U.S. Army and are now fighting on behalf of Ukraine, they're getting a real baptism of fire. Many have said, "Oh my God, we never had this." It's one thing when you're launching artillery strikes at a bunch of Taliban running around the mountains with AK-47s. They can't fire back with artillery. That's not the case now in Ukraine. And the United States is completely ill-equipped to deal with that. They're just, by training and by doctrine right now.
Well, Larry, after the regions of Ukraine post referendums, when they become part of Russia, do you see the conflict in Ukraine escalating? Because obviously, I think Ukraine is going to do everything in its power to test the resolve of the Russians. We saw after the events around Kharkov, the Russians made it clear that they have unique skills with the pain dial. They tapped the brakes and Ukraine went black for a short amount of time, or most of the regions of the country.
Right.
Do you see that is going to be something where we're going to see more infrastructure being targeted? Because during this entire conflict, and I've argued with people that are very pro-Ukrainian, and said your command and control centers are still intact after 7 months. That's not an accident. The Russians have purposely not targeted. They may start doing that now if they test Russia's resolve in these 4 regions.
Yeah, I've been a little puzzled up to this point that particularly when targets inside Russia like Belgorod have been hit by some cruise missiles or Ukrainian artillery, that Russia did not punch back. But once the results are in, the Duma has taken action, and these our new republics are firmly established as part of Russia. The next step would be for Russia to issue a very stark warning that any attack on these territories by you will be considered an act of war, and we will take all necessary steps to defend ourselves. And then the next step after that is you literally turn off the lights in Ukraine. You destroy their inability to move anywhere, anytime, and you take out the command centers, including killing Western military observers. I mean, it's, that's what it's going to take. I think up to this point, Russia was reluctant to do that, fearing that it might escalate the situation. But I think now they understand whether they take the steps to escalate or not. These people in the West are crazy. They continue to insist that they're going to send more advanced weaponry into it. And once you just start destroying those command centers, the ability of these guys to continue the war is going to be severely curtailed. I mean, because right now, I use the comparison with World War II, what Russia experienced, or the then Soviet Union experienced, that even though they had taken enormous losses with the invasions of the Germans, both with Barbarossa and the first go, and then the second case Blau that took place, that despite all that destruction, Russia still was able to move its industrial capability behind the Ural Mountains, rebuild it, and get it up and operating in such a level that they were producing as many tanks, actually more tanks, T-34s, than the United States was in Sherman tank. During the same period. Remarkable. They were able to bring in recruits and train them, and the training was 10 to 12 weeks. So it was not just 1 week of here's a gun, now go get them, Tiger. So they were able to train and equip troops. Yeah,
if I could jump in here, I think I'm trying to understand the timing here with the partial mobilization being announced and an additional 300,000 troops. Now, I've heard various estimates of 2 to 3 months to train these men that have already had some military training. So that gives a little bit of an. What is the timing then? Because we have the referendums, the inclusion into the Russian Federation, and then we have this kind of lull. Oh, by the way, it's going to be winter then. How do you put those pieces together?
Yeah, I think these are reservists. So
right.
As opposed to basic training, where you take somebody who has no prior military training, You have to teach them how to wear a uniform. You have to teach them how to have personal hygiene, how to can have personal hygiene when you're out in the field, so that you don't, make the rest of your fellow soldiers sick. You have to understand rank, a whole lot of things that go into conventional basic training. Well, these reservists don't have to do that. So right away, there's 4 weeks of training you don't have to go through. They know that. They know how to put on their uniforms. They know how to march. They know how to handle firearms. So it's refresher training on getting up to speed on new weapons. If there have been some new weapons introduced into the arsenal, they don't have to be. They may get a refresher course on land navigation, how to use a compass, how to move from point to point when you're navigating over terrain. So I think within as soon as 8 weeks, those who have been called back will be operational and ready to go. Now, all of these are not necessarily going to be put into frontline units. The majority are in supporting roles, whether it's operating artillery or just ensuring that the logistics supplies continue to move forward. But as even with the advent of winter, there will be some weather will hinder some operations, but Russia again they've got the advantage on their side. They've got more drones. They haven't even used their fixed wing aircraft, and I find that really interesting.
Me too.
And here's the reason. Why do you use fixed wing aircraft when you can send cruise missiles and rockets which don't have pilots in them? Because whenever you have a fixed wing aircraft, you always got the risk that they can get shot down. And then you're faced with how do we go recover the pilot, do a combat search and rescue to recover? Well, I think we're living in an age right now when history is written in 50 years. This will be the end of combat aircraft, because all of the literally billions of dollars being spent on these advanced jets that, they can be taken down by a $100,000 missile. So, you get a $100 million aircraft shot by a $100,000 missile, and it's just, the economics don't work out. And yet the drones, the cruise missiles, there are remotely, or as they call them, remotely piloted aircraft. They can operate and exceed some of the capabilities of even the most advanced jet fighters. So I think what we're going to see is that one of the reasons Russia's not using it, it doesn't need to. It's able to accomplish the missions without putting all of those forces at risk, because they may be needed at some point in the future.
Yeah, and CNN reported that on Victory Day here, they didn't have a flyover because they have too few planes. No, it was the weather. I was here. Yeah. It was the weather.
Yeah.
So,
sorry.
Yeah. No, Larry. So you think that they're going to attack? The first thing will be they'll issue an ultimatum, presumably to Ukraine: get your forces out of Russian territory. Or we'll throw them out. And then they will launch attacks against infrastructure, command centers. Do you at all envisage any attacks outside of Ukraine? Do you think any of that will happen?
I think it's potential, because I think the ultimatum is not going to be just to Ukraine. It's going to be to NATO and to the United States.
Yeah.
That any further supply of these weapon systems that are killing Russian citizens will not be tolerated, because the United States wouldn't put up with that. I mean, can you imagine what the United States, how we would be reacting if Russia was supplying its advanced artillery systems to Mexico, to, let's call it, some Mexican bandits, drug cartels, and those cartels were using it to shell cities in the United States? Do you think the United States would sit back and say, oh, that's okay, we'll just, ignore it? Hell no. We would, the people would be up in arms. So I don't know why it is that we would think that the Russians are somehow less reactive than we would be in similar circumstances when attacked. So I think it's entirely possible that Russia's going to lay out that kind of stop this, cut it off, or any centers that are providing those weapons will be targets. They are legitimate military targets. And then what's the West? Go ahead.
And Larry, public opinion here will be intolerable. That would be intolerable is that, and a lot of people don't know this, and it's something that I've reflected upon many times, is that when we look at the 8 years of the Donbass being shelled and blockaded, it was, the Western narrative is, Putin is meddling in Russia, Putin is doing, but over on my side of the pond, people would say, he isn't doing enough to protect our people. And he took it in the public opinion polls as a result. And now with the advent of the special military operation, the train has left the station and there is no reverse until you get to station victory, okay? And so I'm absolutely convinced George is right, an ultimatum, and then make my day because we're ready. And I think that the West is so delusional about its own capacity and moral righteousness that it has no idea what's going to face them.
Yeah, it's a lot. It's sort of, I don't know if you've ever had to deal with anybody that's had substance abuse, whether drugs or alcohol, but the United States is very much like, an alcoholic, where they have not come to grips with what the real affliction is. And we've got the greatest military in the world. Well, listen, we got a lot of terrific people, but we don't. Remember, we basically got our ass kicked by the Taliban, a bunch of goat herders. And in Iraq, we did anything but win in Iraq. If you want to call that a victory, good luck. It didn't stabilize the country, and it just created more chaos. So the United States has not won a military, and including in Vietnam. It's a touchy subject over here. I've got a lot of friends. I'm 67, so I was at the very cusp of that. It was ending as I hit 18. But my older friends who were Vietnam veterans, they still in their mind, oh, we could have won that. We could have won that. And to try to say, no, you couldn't. No, not real. Yeah, if we would have put 2 million men into Vietnam and just leveled the place, quote, yeah, we could have, quote, won, but what would we have won? And it was not the kind of, it wasn't like, ending the Nazi regime or ending the Tokyo regime that brought on World War II. It was, there was not going to be that, clean break. And then, so in the aftermath of that, we've almost, the military industrial complex is a real thing. It's alive and breathing. And no matter what happens, I don't know if you ever saw the Saturday Night Live skit with Christopher Walken, More Cowbell.
More cowbell, so, yeah.
No matter what happens in the West, whether, the Soviet Union has broken up, more cowbell. Well, we've been attacked by terrorists, more cowbell. Well, we've lost in Afghanistan, more cowbell. So the defense budget keeps going up regardless of what's happening on the world stage. So now, instead of building robust military capabilities to fight, people running around with rags on their heads, we're building robust military capability to stop the Chinese and the Russians. So it keeps changing as a justification to spend $800 billion now, or in excess of that. And you look at what Russia gets for its dollars. I think they spend like $100 billion, and it has some really robust, incredible weapon systems. They're getting a lot more bang for the buck.
Sorry, what do you think the United States will do in response to the Russian ultimatum and then the Russian attacks on command centers, maybe even outside of Ukraine proper? How will the United States respond? Will they say, okay, that's far, no further, we don't want to escalate, or will they then escalate? Because that's really the question. How will the United States respond?
I think they'll escalate. The wise thing of what they should do would be to find a way to start disengaging on this and try to reopen back channel communications with the Russians and say, okay, well, this weapons flow is going to stop, and we need to figure out a way to disengage. I think, given the political environment that's in the United States, the Biden administration can't afford to be perceived as weak, as a surrender monkey, and so they will then so by God, these Russians aren't going to tell us what to do. We'll show them. But the reality is they're not going to actually be able to do anything that's consequential other than get U.S. people killed. And then when the U.S. people are getting killed and there is no response, that's going to be that moment that alcoholic wakes up and realizes, geez, I'm going to die if I don't do something different.
Well, as a continuation to George's question, I tend to think there'll be some form of escalation. But I think that will give the green light for those in Russia that have wanted it for a long time for just simple regime change in Kiev. Because, at the end of the day, if we look at it more broadly of what's going on here, and George and I have discussed this at great length, the Russians are not going to do this again in 5 years. They're not going to do this again in 10 years. They want a resolution to this. And we all have to remember, how did this all come about? Russia sent its ultimatum, or its notes, diplomat, whatever, to Brussels and to Washington on December 17th, said, this is the way it's going to be. If not, then there will be consequences. February 24th. And nothing has changed in that respect. Russia will call an end to this conflict unilaterally when it has achieved the goals that it wants. And we know that those goals, at least in the way George and I have looked at it, have evolved since February 24th.
Right. No, I agree with that. It's actually sort of, it highlights the limitations of elections. And what I mean by that is, if you go back and remember when Zelensky was first elected in Ukraine, there was a lot of hope attached to that. Yep. Because people in the Donbass voted for him because he was talking about bringing an end to the war. So all these great hopes invested in him at the time that, the election will be the solution, turned out to be the exact opposite. And I bring that up now in reference to what just happened in Italy. Yes, they've got a new conservative, someone who's anti-woke in many aspects, but that doesn't necessarily translate into they're going to go to the EU and say, we got to cut this crap with Russia. We are destroying ourselves. We need to get back on a more normal diplomatic footing and find a way peacefully to resolve this. I don't think that's going to happen. And so that's where the West is going to run into this brick wall of reality. We saw, going back to Iraq, the invasion in 2003, when Baghdad Bob, the Iraqi defense minister, was insisting that there were no tanks in Baghdad, and you could see the images off of CNN and others of the tanks rolling into Baghdad. That's what it's going to be like for Joe Biden and Schultz in Germany and Macron in France and Truss in the UK. They're going to have to come to grips with, no matter what we want to say about the valiant Ukrainian fight, they're beat. They don't have any more army to deploy. The point I was making earlier, comparing the World War II period, Ukraine doesn't have a place to mobilize troops in Ukraine that's safe from missile attack. Every place the Russians can reach out and touch any place they want in the Ukraine. And they sent that message very early on in this conflict when they hit Yavoriv back on March 13th, which was, Yavoriv was essentially a de facto NATO base. Even though it was presented as a Ukrainian military facility, it was where NATO did a lot of training, and not just defensive training. They trained for offensive cyber operations. So when Russia hit that, I know it set off alarm bells in the US military command structure, because they were like, we had no warning. How did they do this? And oh my God, they've killed and disrupted a number of people that we thought were going to be part of the operation.
Yes.
Well, something that I keep thinking about here. Does NATO survive this?
I don't think so.
I don't think so.
I don't see how they do. Yeah, I don't see how they do. Did you see there was a press conference? They had the NATO conference last week, and there was a press conference with this Admiral Barr, I think his name was, and general from the Defense Forces of Estonia. And maybe you guys can enlighten me on this. The general from Estonia said that one of the future priorities of NATO, and he said this with a straight face, so I had to take him that he was being honest, is promoting diversity in NATO. Now, now, last I checked, NATO is basically a bunch of countries with Caucasian people, largely blonde, blue-eyed, but get the swarthy Italians. Okay, we'll toss them in there. But what the hell does he mean? I mean, are they talking about, well, okay, we're going to import Africans and Asians?
There's a lot of white people in Europe. Who knew? Who knew?
Shocker.
Well, they
Shocker.
do keep talking about expanding into Asia. I mean, Liz Truss talked about that, part of our Indo-Pacific strategy, and NATO talked about that in its strategic concept, our Indo-Pacific strategy. So they want to move to the east and thereby antagonize an awful lot more countries than they've already antagonized.
And George, at the same time, there's going to be another Scottish referendum. So what is Liz Truss talking about? Okay, little England, we have grand ambitions in the Indo-Pacific region. I mean, this is comical.
Yeah, it is. If there were not people actually being killed in this would be Monty Python type of theater. It is just it's ludicrous. But yet I listened to this guy, and he was serious. He was keen on promoting diversity in NATO, and it's like, what are you going to have? The transgender brigade?
Yes.
Is that what's afoot? I don't get it. So it shows that even these guys who have years of experience and who wear uniforms and who are intellectually intelligent are completely out of touch with reality, and they don't even recognize the absurdity of what they're saying. And they say it, and everybody else goes, yeah, that's for sure. Yeah, diversity.
Yeah, but, I
always think crap.
But living here in Russia, before February 24th, economists universally said that believed that the Russian ruble was a soft currency. I believed it too. Now it's a very hard currency. Okay, and this is something, and it's backed up not by a printing machine, but by commodities. It is a commodity-based currency. And I check the exchange rate every single day. It's just, George and I talked about the build up to the conflict for months and months. And I have to say, in all honesty, the ruble element completely took me by surprise in a huge, huge way. And I've been asked about it, and I said, it's going to stay more or less where it is for a while, at least. Okay, because because of sanctions, the flight from the dollar, the implications of this for the Western economy is extraordinary. And people talk about a cold winter. Let's talk about the next 5 cold winters if they're continuing on the current trajectory. I mean, just the catastrophe that they've brought upon themselves, and there's no fixing it. No, there isn't. They had the Minsk Accords. The West blew Russia off. Why should they sit down and make agreements now? I don't see any reason why. It's the same interlocutors. Their credibility is zero. And living here for almost a quarter of a century, now the rhetoric is quite rough. And I've always been mystified talking to my Russian friends. Why do you always say our Western partners and all of that? Because they hate you. And that is beginning to change. So I think this is a break. And there's no mending of ties. It's not going to take one female Italian prime minister saying, I think we should rethink our Russia policy. No, that train has left the station a long time ago.
Yeah, no, I agree. The confronting the propaganda, I think, is going to be one of the major challenges. Like last week when when the partial mobilization was called up, boy, the Western propaganda on this just went crazy. So they're posting videos of, it's like every man in Russia under the age of 28, between the ages of 18 and 28, was fleeing to the border, going to Georgia, going to Finland. They were lined up at the airport. They were lined up in cars. But I went to something you said about the ruble. I just went and checked the price of the ruble, because if in fact you had large numbers of people fleeing Russia, well, they're going to need foreign currency. How do you get foreign currency? Well, you take your rubles and you buy the foreign currency. And when you do that, you end up driving the price of the ruble down, driving the price of the foreign currency up. And as I looked at the price of the ruble was going up.
Yep.
So it's like,
That,
okay, so
I checked it 2 hours ago, exactly true. Yes.
that's a very good point. I mean, and that's interesting that the media never do that. It's like that's a very obvious piece of research that you could do. Hey, if they're really fleeing by the tens of thousands, then that would affect the ruble. And of course, it hasn't done so. And in fact, there's no real evidence at all either for these mass protests, which are all massive. Where are the mass protests? Or the people fleeing the country. But as you say, I mean, it is the propaganda model. And I don't know how we can address the propaganda model. I mean, the media is now so wedded into propaganda. Just look at the New York Times. If it isn't the story about Trump in January the 6th, then it's about Putin and Ukraine. I mean, that's it. That's just those are the only two stories that the New York Times would cover.
And they won't report within the first 24 hours after the proclamation of the partial mobilization. Non-reservists, I'm not counting reservists, but 10,000 young men in 24 hours went to the recruiting station, signed up. And these are not reservists, and they were under no obligation to do it, but they did.
Yeah.
That wasn't reported up.
Yeah, this phenomena, this shifts. It's not to be a shifted topic, but it's just to illustrate. I don't know if you saw all the rumors that suddenly surfaced that President Xi of China was under house arrest, that he had been arrested, and that the coup was underway in China. And then, Xi has arrested 3 top members of the party, and there's a purge under. So this is this is burning all over the internet. Social media is lighting up, and people are, oh my God. And there's there's nothing. I mean, there's nothing from China to vouch. And I looked at it and I said, I think this was like someone conducting a test of a company that was wanting to get hired to do social media propaganda. So here's your task. Can you convince the world that a coup is underway in China? Here you go. Here's what we can do. Because it's so detached from reality. And
Larry, a derivative of that is, and I believe it very strongly, COVID was a very interesting exercise in social control as well. Okay, what works, what doesn't work. Okay, and during that entire exercise, we come up with the maybe enhanced misinformation, disinformation, because that's what we get all of the time now. But before 2016, we never used these types of words. Maybe specialists did in the intelligence community, but it wasn't common parlance. Now it is. Okay, so I mean, I think this crashing of this propaganda effort regarding Ukraine, I'm going to be fascinated in how they're going to have to deal with it, because I've never, we all remember the build up to the 2003 invasion of Iraq, but that's nothing compared to what they've done here on this case.
The point about the 2003 invasion of Iraq is that there was no reckoning in the media, and that's kind of why we got ourselves into this mess in Russia. And it's the same people. I mean, it's not like, a whole brand new bunch of people. It's the same people. Victoria Nuland and her husband, Kagan, and the entire Kagan family. Again, they were there before Iraq. They're here. So all of the same crowd. They just sort of moved. They just shifted, and then they moved. Okay, well, we got Iraq. Now we're going to Russia. And so because there was really no reckoning, people were promoted. They got nice media gigs. People in the George W. Bush administration, like Dana Perino, she was the flag for Bush. She's got a nice gig at Fox News. So when there's no reckoning, then, that's it. They can just go on, spreading their propaganda and waging the next war.
Yeah, you put your, George, I think that's really the most critical point about the lack of accountability. That, think that there is a screw up, that you try to find someone who was responsible or a group of someones who are responsible and hold them accountable. But the media never takes stock of people who come on and make predictions and make certain pronouncements and then turn out to be completely wrong. and consistently wrong. And the same in government, where like when the United States hit the Chinese embassy, I think it was in Sudan,
in Belgrade.
back on
It was in Belgrade when they were
it was in Belgrade
bombing Yugoslavia.
under Clinton, and ultimately they ended up blaming some lower level
That's right.
CIA analysts,
Yes.
as opposed to recognizing that no lower level CIA analyst had the ability to make that sort of judgment and conclusion without a bunch of senior people signing off. Let's call it the My Lai phenomena, because as in the case of My Lai, the entire massacre was blamed upon Lieutenant William Calley. His entire chain of command, who knew about it, who knew about prior incidents and did nothing, they were never called to account. So what happens is, once they learn that this game can be played, and the first law of plumbing, that all sewage runs downhill, you can always pin the blame on the lower, the people at the bottom of the heap, and you continue to go on and do what you do without regards. That lack of accountability is toxic, and I think, frankly, that's going to be the death of the West.
I think we can finish off on this here. We've talked about other conflicts in which the interventions around the world. But when you think of the intervention in Iraq, how did that affect everyday people in Europe and in the United States? Maybe later with immigration, that's one issue. But it's something you heard on the news if you pay attention to the news. This is very different. Challenging a nuclear power, NATO actually turning on its engine. We're going to see it doesn't work. Okay, NATO was designed never to do this. Okay, that's why they joined it, never to fight a conflict. Okay, and now we have these supply chain issues, energy issues, food issues. This has all come home to the West. And that's what makes it so importantly different this time, because people say, like, this time it's going to be different. I used to be in finance. You get shot for saying that, okay? Because you can never say that. In this case, it is different. And this whole regime change mentality is going to end up changing regimes in the West itself.
Yeah, this is the first war, think about this, since World War II, that America and Europe have been involved in, that's causing direct economic harm to the populace. Now, Vietnam went on, and the United States was deficit spending, and except for the families of those soldiers who were killed or wounded, the rest of America really didn't suffer. And the same with Afghanistan, the same with Iraq, Iraq 1, Iraq 2. In some cases, the economy actually got better, but not now. And the United States is lagging a little behind Europe in terms of the economic devastation to come, but the warning signs are there, and it's bad, and it's going to get worse. And then at that point, it's that economic pain that suddenly awakens people from this delusional slumber.
Right. But I think we'll see what, Europe, there are already indications. I think the Italian case is an indication, the Swedish case is an indication. And I would think that this is going to spread in Europe, a real discontent, particularly with the cold winter that's coming. Anyway, Larry, thank you so much for giving us your time. It was a really fascinating discussion. So many insights, and so it's very, very stimulating for me, for Peter, and I'm sure for all of our gagglers. So thank you so much.
Well, I am honored that you would even consider me. So thanks, guys.
Everybody reads you, Larry. Everybody. Okay. I get messages all the time, links, everything. Okay. I mean, you're worth talking to, and you're certainly worth listening to. And I wish people in the media would listen a little bit more instead of just opining their nonsense. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And we hope to have you back again very soon. Thank you.
All right.
And remember, if you like the gaggle, please like, share, and subscribe. See you soon. Bye.